Ask most people where weed comes from, and they will say things like California, Amsterdam, or Colorado. But what almost nobody ever says is a freezing mountain range between Afghanistan and Pakistan. But that is the honest answer for just about half of the strains we know of today, because one tough little plant from those mountains became the backbone of nearly every indica on Earth. This is the story of Hindu Kush. So let's start with the place itself. The Hindu Kush is a giant mountain range, about 500 miles long, that runs through Afghanistan and Pakistan, with its far edge brushing up against Tajikistan and the broader Central Asia region. And this is not gentle country we're talking about here. It's high altitude, has freezing cold nights, thin, dry air, and some peaks that climb over 25,000 feet tall, with the tallest one being a peak called Tirich Mir, which sits on the Pakistan side. And for thousands of years, this range was a place armies and traders had to cross to move between Central Asia and India. But crossing them came at a cost, and you can hear it in the name itself. Because the most repeated translation of Hindu Kush is Slayer of Indians. And the old explanation is that enslaved people being marched across those mountains would freeze to death in the cold and the snow. Now historians argue about whether that's the true origin or just a grim old legend, so take it as a story, not a settled fact. But either way, it tells you how harsh this place is. And cannabis has been growing wild up in those mountains for a very, very long time. And that harsh environment is the exact reason this plant turned out the way it did. Because when you drop a cannabis plant into cold, dry mountains with intense sunlight beating down on it, it adapts to survive. It grows short and stocky and bushy instead of tall, so the wind doesn't destroy it. It grows wide, dark leaves. And most importantly, it coats itself in a thick layer of resin, those sticky crystals called trichomes, partly to protect itself from the cold and the harsh sun. So the mountain basically engineered a short, tough, resin-drenched plant. And that plant is what we now call an indica. Now that thick resin didn't just protect the plant, it became the entire point, because that region has one of the oldest hash-making traditions on Earth. So let me quickly explain what hash even is, because it matters here. Hashish is basically concentrated resin. All the good stuff in weed, the THC and the smell, lives inside those little trichomes. So instead of smoking the whole flower, you separate just the resin off the plant, collect it into a pile, and press it together into a solid block or ball. That's hash, and it's way stronger than the flower it came from. So the traditional way they did it in this region was to dry the plants and then sift them through fine screens, knocking all that powdery resin loose so they could press it into a product locals called garda or keef. But there was also a completely different method called keras, where you'd rub fresh living plants between your palms, collecting the raw resin directly off the plant before it was ever dried. So you had two distinct traditions coming out of these mountains: the dry sift pressed blocks and the hand-rubbed keras. And the Hindu Kush plants were absolutely perfect for both, because they made so much resin in the first place. And this wasn't just some small local thing either, because Afghan hash traveled through the old Silk Road trade routes and became famous across the world, with certain regions like Mazar-i-Sharif and Balkh province putting out hash people still talk about today. And for centuries, farmers in those mountains were growing this exact plant specifically to make some of the most legendary hash on the planet. So how did a plant from the mountains of Afghanistan end up in your dispensary in America, you may ask? Well, that is where the story gets interesting, because, weirdly enough, it comes down to a bunch of hippies. Back in the 1960s and 70s, there was this famous route called the Hippie Trail, where young travelers from Europe and America would make this long overland trip heading east, going all the way through Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and Nepal, usually on almost no money. It was this whole counterculture pilgrimage with hundreds of thousands of people over the years. And let's be real, a huge reason a lot of them went was the hash. Places like Kabul in Afghanistan were legendary stops because there would be whole streets where the hashish was cheap, strong, and out in the open. For a young traveler in 1970, this was paradise. And this went on right up until the end of the 70s, when the Iranian Revolution and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan basically slammed the door on the whole route. But by then, the trail had already left something behind. Because these travelers did not just smoke it and go home. Some of them grabbed seeds from these incredible resin-heavy mountain plants and carried them back west to America and Europe. And that little act of stuffing some seeds in a bag on the way home is what changed everything. Because those seeds landed in America at a very specific moment. At the time, basically all the weed being grown in the West came from equatorial places near the tropics. Think Mexican, Colombian, Thai, and those plants that we call sativas. They're tall, they take forever to finish, and they need a long, warm growing season. Great weed, but a nightmare to actually grow, especially indoors or up north where it gets cold. And then this Hindu Kush plant shows up, and it's the complete opposite. It's short, it fits indoors. It finishes flowering fast, somewhere around 7 to 9 weeks, unlike the usual 4 or 5 months sativas take. It's covered in resin, and on top of all of that, it grows dense, heavy buds. So for a grower, this thing solved every single problem the tall sativas had. So the breeders did the obvious thing and focused on it. They started off by crossing the two. They took the short, fast, resin-packed indica from the mountains and bred it with the tall, flavorful, energetic sativas they already had. And that cross ended up being the most important thing that ever happened to weed. Because suddenly, you could get a plant that had the best of both. The speed and the yield and the density of the indica, plus the flavor and the high of the sativa. And critically, you could actually grow it indoors under lights, which is where the entire modern weed industry ended up. That right there is the Indica revolution. And almost every hybrid strain that exists today came out of breeders mixing these two worlds together. And the Hindu Kush was the mountain that made that possible. And I'll be honest with you about one thing here, because it's a fair point. On its own, pure mountain indica like this was originally hash material, and a lot of the old smokers considered it kind of rough and one-note compared to a fine sativa. That's actually a big part of why breeders kept crossing it back with those flavorful sativas instead of just smoking it straight. They weren't after the pure plant. They were after what it could do when you mixed its toughness and speed into everything else. Which brings us to the word itself, Kush, and how it took over. Because Hindu Kush didn't just contribute to a few strains, it became the ancestor of an entire dynasty. The most famous one is OG Kush, the strain that basically defined premium American weed for a whole generation and is itself the parent of a huge number of strains you see today. And OG Kush's story traces right back to a Hindu Kush plant that got crossed into an American line back in the early 90s. From OG Kush, you get Bubba Kush, known for those coffee and chocolate notes. You get Purple Kush, which is Hindu Kush crossed with a purple Afghani. You get Master Kush, which came straight from Hindu Kush landraces over in Amsterdam and took home the High Times Cannabis Cup in 1992 and 1993. And that's before you even get to all the grandchildren, the strains built on top of those. The family tree just goes on, and every branch of it climbs back to that same mountain. And over time, the word Kush stopped even being about one specific plant. It became a signal. When you see Kush on a label, it's telling you to expect that heavy, relaxing, resinous indica experience. It even got so big that people started using the word Kush as straight-up slang for weed in general. So think about all of that. one single word that is on 1,000 different menus. Trace back to those mountains. So what is pure Hindu Kush actually like to smoke? Well, it's a pure indica, so it's deeply relaxing and physical. It's a heavy body high, the kind that melts you into the couch and makes you sleepy. It's a nighttime strain, good for winding down, stress, and sleep. The smell is old world, earthy, sweet, a little bit like sandalwood or incense, with that classic hashy, musky note, which profile is dominated by myrcene and caryophyllene terpenes, which are the same terpenes responsible for that dank, spicy, deeply physical quality you find across the whole Kush family. It doesn't smell like the sweet candy and fuel strains of today. It smells like where it came from. As for strength, it usually tests somewhere in the high teens to around 20% THC, which is moderate now but was plenty back in the day. Now I want to be straight with you about one thing. Hindu Kush and Afghani get talked about like they're the same thing, and a lot of the time people use those words interchangeably. They're both Indica landraces from that same mountain region, so the line between them is genuinely blurry. The way most people separate them is that Hindu Kush usually refers to the plants from the higher, colder elevations, often on the Pakistan side, while Afghani tends to refer to plants from the lower Afghan valleys. But honestly, nobody can draw you a hard line, and anybody who claims they can is guessing. They're cousins from the same mountains. So does the pure original Hindu Kush still exist, you may ask? Well, this is the sad irony of the whole story. Its genetics are inside a massive chunk of all the weed on Earth. But the actual pure landrace, growing in those mountains, is now rare and threatened. Decades of war, government eradication campaigns, and crossbreeding have chipped away at the original plant. What keeps it alive now is a handful of dedicated seed banks that collect and preserve the real landrace seeds straight from those valleys. But strangely, all that chaos and war also protected it in a weird way. Because Afghanistan was so unstable for so long, no government ever fully wiped out the crop the way they did in other countries. So the old plant survived in remote mountain valleys where nobody could get to it. So at the end of the day, Hindu Kush is proof that the most important thing in your dispensary might not be a strain at all, but a place. A cold, harsh mountain range that spent centuries shaping a short, tough, resin-covered plant. A few travelers carried its seeds back west, breeders crossed it with everything they had, and it became the entire indica half of modern weed. Every Kush on the shelf, every heavy nighttime indica, every hybrid that finishes fast enough to grow indoors, all of it owes something to those mountains.